The three of us are all going to take on different things. We're not going to be able to do everything as advertised. We've got a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to focus on the point counts. Doug's going to talk about the Marshburg Survey and how that relates to the atlas. And Mark's going to talk about finding nests and about work in the remote north. We ended up concluding we had too much to cover, so we're not going to cover the owl surveys here. We have done that previously on the SAPI hour and would encourage you, if you want to find out more about the owl surveys. Of course, all the information is on the website, but there's also videos on the Atlas YouTube channel to get more details on those. So I'll jump right into the point counts because, like I said, we have a lot of ground to cover here. So point counts in a nutshell. And Daryl, I don't know if you're out there, just say hello. I stole some pictures from Atlas 2, and this is Daryl doing a point count back in Atlas 2. So point counts are all about getting information on the relative abundance of each of the species. So if you have a copy of the Atlas, you know this, but this is what the book looks like. The map at the bottom left here is the map based on breeding evidence. So different colored oranges and reds there are different weights of breeding evidence. And the black dots show whether the bird was there show birds that were there in Atlas 1, but not in Atlas 2. So you can see the breeding evidence maps give us the overall picture of where the bird breeds during the Atlas period, and allows us to look at how that's changed over time, and shows us the overall pattern of occurrence and strength of breeding. Now the map at the top right here, this is the relative abundance map. This is what comes from the point counts, and this is what we're talking about today. So Atlas 2 we had tremendous success with. We were the first atlas in North America to introduce this idea of doing point counts to count relative abundance for atlases, and now it's done on just about every atlas that comes along. Atlasers got into it big time. We were just shocked at the extent of pickup with Atlas 2, and we're hoping we can continue with that in Atlas 3. 68,000 point counts, which was far more than we ever dreamed we would get across the continent. And it's, to me, this is going to be one of the highlights of the project, to be able to compare back 20 years ago and look at how these patterns of relative abundance have changed over time between the two projects. Of course, that's going to give us insight into the patterns of change, and that's going to help us get some idea about what kind of things might be driving these patterns that we're seeing, and that researchers are going to be able to delve deeper into that point count data. Okay, so I showed this slide earlier, but different examples of what some of the different species distributions look like. I've used these 4-letter codes here for the different species. These are really handy. If you haven't learned the 4-letter codes yet, would really recommend doing it. You'll see why as I go through. But so the northern rough-winged swallow down at the bottom left there, a bird pretty much restricted to the southern part of the province, very concentrated though. The breeding evidence data didn't show the extent to which the bird is concentrated right around the shores of Lake Erie and the very southwest part of the province. The one that most interests me here is the Wilson snipe. You'll see how it's widely distributed across southern Ontario, absent from the southwest portion, but high numbers in that area south of the Shield in eastern Ontario. But when you get up in the Hudson Bay lowlands, you can see huge numbers of birds up in there. And the point count data reveals this, where the other sources of information just aren't able to give us that same depth of knowledge. So point counts, these are the primary methods of learning about relative abundance of all land birds. When you hear that 3 billion birds have disappeared from North America, that's largely based on breeding bird survey data, which is point counts. And so there's a rich history of doing point counts across the continent. It's a very, very simple survey. Involves standing at one spot in the atlas. Most of those points are predetermined. You stand for a set amount of time, in our case, 5 minutes, and you count all the birds that you hear and see during that 5-minute period. They're done during the peak of the breeding season, and I'll touch on when that is, but basically it's late May through early July, and they're done in the early morning when birds are most active singing. They do give us this ability to look at how populations changed over time, how as you saw in those maps, how the numbers vary across the landscape. And they do give us this ability to look at actual population sizes for a lot of species. And so that's going to be one of the real advantages to this point count data. So there are two types for the atlas. One is a just traditional point count, pretty much as I described on that last slide. And the new one is a digital point count. Now, we're introducing this again to North America. We're out there in front of everybody else. Nobody is having volunteers collect data by point counts on anything like the scale that we're attempting here for Atlas 3. So I'm hoping for widespread cooperation on this one as well. The nice thing about digital point counts is you don't necessarily have to know your birds well. You just use a handheld digital recorder at each point instead of actually having to identify birds yourself. We can do this because the great majority of birds on point counts are detected by sound. Another nice thing about this, of course, is we have a recording that's now, it's permanent. We can look at that, so people can look at that 100 years from now and dig out things. They can also have it, we're learning more and more about how to extract data from these recordings automatically, and they're going to be able to do more of that kind of thing over time and look at patterns of the bird song that we can't even imagine looking at this point. We are working with the University of Alberta on something called Wild Tracks, and over the next few weeks we'll be sort of rolling out information about this and how we're going to manage and interpret these recordings. So the point count setup in Southern Ontario is, as shown on the map here, there are 40 numbered locations on there. There's actually a mix of stations on here. We took 15 stations that had been done in Atlas 2, and we're repeating those. We've changed the numbering system, but we've got 15 repeat points from Atlas 2, and we've got some new ones to try and compensate for the fact that the landscape's changed quite a bit. I'm thinking about suburban development and that kind of thing that has roads in it that we want to be able to follow using the point count data. So at each one of those points, you go out and you do your 5-minute point count. I'll come back to some other stuff about the map. But various ways of recording information for point counts. One of them is on the app, and this is what the app looks like. So instead of just like in Atlas 2, we just recorded the whole 5 minutes. How many birds did you report in that 5-minute period? This time we've introduced 2 time bands. So how many birds do you get in that first 3 minutes? And then you just add on any additional birds that you get in the second. And this is useful for us. It helps us look at the likelihood that we're detecting all of the birds that are occurring in that area. And by using the 3 minutes, we can tie in to the breeding bird survey that I mentioned before and use the breeding bird survey data in the Atlas because the breeding bird survey already uses 3-minute point counts. And so you can see for each bird, you're just recording a number of birds for in each of those 2 time bands. I should mention, we're also asking that you record the higher level of breeding evidence. So if you do find birds carrying food, or you get a distraction display or something like that, or you see fledged young, you can actually tap on the species name and it will pop up with the breeding evidence box, and you can actually add that fact. I'd recommend you do that after the 5 minutes is up, but we are encouraging to collect information that way as well on breeding evidence. So you can, of course, do this on a notebook. You don't have to use an app. Frankly, personally, I'm going to use my notebook to collect data because it's just, I'm not the fastest with my thumbs, but I'm pretty fast with a pencil. So this is where the 4-letter codes come in very handy, as on the app. It's much quicker if you can. You have a good solid system of using 4-letter codes, and would encourage you to do that. Like on this example, you can also record the higher levels of breeding evidence that you get while doing the point count. Now, we are often offering other possibilities. If you are comfortable estimating the distance from yourself to birds, you can take the sort of more advanced route here and put birds into distance bands as well as those time bands. So the distance bands are less than 50 meters, 50 to 100, or greater than 100. You just classify each bird that you see as to which of those 3 bands it's in. Record the number of birds of each, record breeding evidence if it's a higher level, and you've got all that information there. So then you can then go and input that data to the Atlas website. And of course, you can do the same thing in a tabular form like this. Again, I'll probably use this tabular form. I find this the most straightforward way of doing it. It just, because to some extent, the data is already tabulated. I don't have to figure out from that circle how many of each species I got and that kind of thing. It's already there for data entry. So those 4-letter codes, they are going to be on the website, and you can use those. I would encourage you to use them. It really streamlines things for you. Just to quickly mention the way it works. If you have a species that just has one name, like an anhinga, or what else do we have, like a sora, you just use the first 4 letters of the name. So in this case, A-N-H-I for anhinga. If it's a 2-word name, you just use the first 2 letters of each of the 2 words. If it's a 3-word name, you use the first, and the first 2. And then if it's a 4-letter name, you use the first letter of each of the 4 words. And so come up with those 4-letter codes and streamline your data entry. So back to this, in addition to doing the 20 roadside points that you're asked to do in each square, if you look at the large circle there, it indicates a number of off-road points. And we have sort of calculated for each square how well the roadside layer represents the square. And so in this case, we need 4 more points in broadleaf forest, so off-road points in broadleaf forest, in order to make up for the shortage on the roadside of that habitat, and the same with mixed forest. So each square has its own specifications, and you're to find your way to patches of habitat. Try and get out into the middle of the patch of habitat. Make sure as much as you can that it's 100 meters of that habitat all around you in a circle, and start your point count. I also note here the A and the B are Atlas point counts that were done in off-road situations in Atlas 2. And so again, you can see the obvious advantage. If we can repeat those same points, it gives us a very direct comparison to the past Atlas. So we've made up to 10 points available if off-road points were done in each of those, in each square that they were done. The square summary sheet has information on it, as well as the map as to how many of those off-road point counts you're requested to do in each square. Now the recorded point counts, then, we've purchased these Zoom H2N units, made those available to regional coordinators. Each regional coordinator has 1 or 2 of these. We'll hopefully get more in future years, but they can be loaned out to atlasers for the collection of data. You don't need to be an expert to do this. You can get these from your regional coordinator. When you've done the recording, you download the information. Or if you're not comfortable with the sort of downloading process, you can just return the unit to the regional coordinator, and they'll do the downloading. We are going to be developing wild tracks, as I mentioned, and we are going to be developing this idea of crowdsourcing. So if you're an expert birder, you can identify birds well by song. You can go onto the website, pull off a point count, listen to it, interpret it, and that way we get the data. And we'll be certainly encouraging people to be doing that over the course of the project. So if you are using a Zoom unit at a point, you just basically go out, you set up the Zoom, make sure that the settings are correct. You write down in your notebook the date, the time, the square number, and the point number, and then you start the recording. And then you read out loud the date, the time, the square, and the point number. And so that's on the recording as a permanent record. And then you start the timer and you start your recording. It runs for 5 minutes. You get a beep to tell you your 5 minutes is up, or actually you'll need a 3-minute and a final 2-minute beep. And then you just press stop and you go on to the next. next stop. Now, I should say we have got manuals in the works that they're now translated, but they should be on the website in the next couple of weeks to give you all the details on how this works. Our goals are to cover, basically, we want to get these done in every square in Southern Ontario, in the dark green area there, either traditional point counts or digital point counts, about 5% in the middle part of the province there where there's reasonable road access, and then 2% of squares in the far north. You can download the point count locations from the website. This is sort of a split screen. So the top half of the screen is just, you can go to the Square Resources tab, press on that. It will open up these maps. You pick out your square, and then you can see on the right there, your ability to download the map in the point count locations in a format that works best for you. And there are videos on the website or on the Atlas YouTube channel that describe in more detail how you can do that. Okay, so sorry to skip through that so quickly, but got to hand things off to Doug to talk about Marshburg Survey. I'm just going to change the slide, so just let me know whenever you need me to change, Doug.
Sounds good. Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so what I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes is, hopefully in 15, is give an overview of the Atlas 3 Marshburg survey. Next slide, please, Mike. So this is one of the 3 special surveys for Atlas 3, the others being owls and nightjars, of course, like you see here. And I'd like to point out right off the top that there are, at least in my mind, many conceptual similarities between the protocols for these 3 special surveys. So if you're finding the many details, a bit overwhelming because they are a bit detailed, you'll be happy to know that there's at least some overlap at a high level in how the 3 are set up. Next slide, please. So first things first, why do we even need a special Marshbird survey? We already have the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program delivered by Birds Canada, and a few marsh birds are picked up on regular roadside Atlas point counts. So, can't we just use data from these other programs to get what we need? Next slide, please. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, the answer, of course, is no. We can't just use data from these other data sets. The Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program has good coverage in Southern Ontario, south of the Shield, as you see here in the map, but coverage is too sparse in Central Ontario, and it's pretty well non-existent in Northern Ontario to get what we really want out of this. And we tried mapping marsh birds using regular roadside point count data from Atlas 2, and there's just too few detections for it to work well. Next slide, please. So we've designed the Marshburg survey to fill these knowledge and data gaps. And we anticipate at least 2 main science products from the effort. So one, the first ever abundance maps for marshbird species like American coot, common gallinule, least bittern, pied-billed grebe, sora, and Virginia rail. And 2, the first ever robust total population size estimates for all of those species I just listed for the entire province. And both of these products will be extremely useful in multiple different ways for conservation planning. Next slide, please. So what's involved? So in terms of skill level, participants must be able to identify all local birds by sight and by song and call. And being able to identify common wetland plants is helpful, as there is a simple but quick habitat assessment to be done at each survey location. But as we shall see, good plant ID is definitely not required. Next slide, please. So the Marshbird survey occurs throughout the entire province, but to ensure a representative sample of squares, we've randomly identified priority Marshbird survey squares, which is what you see here. These have been stratified in various ways as indicated by the different colors and by anticipated atlaser capacity, with fewer squares selected per unit area north of tomogamy and more south of tomogamy. Although atlasers are encouraged, if they wish, to complete the Marshbird survey in any square, even if it isn't a priority square. But obviously the priority squares are the focus. Next slide, please. The timing is 24th of May to 10th of July south of Temagami, and 1st of June to 10th of July north of Temagami. And these are the same date windows as the regular roadside atlas point counts. Surveys can be done in the morning or in the evening, a little bit different than some of the other point counts for the atlas. So this means 30 minutes before sunrise until 5 hours after sunrise, or 4 hours before sunset until 30 minutes after sunset. And these are the same timing windows as regular roadside atlas point counts for morning, and they're the same as the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program for evening. And evening surveys are allowed, of course, because the detection probabilities of the targeted species like bitterns and rails are very similar in the morning or the evening as a result of the broadcast, the playback that we'll talk a bit about later. So allowing evening surveys makes things much more flexible for atlasers to get everything done. Next slide, please. So like owl and nightjar surveys, there are restrictions on acceptable weather in terms of wind and precipitation. And like owl surveys, like I mentioned before, there's a standardized broadcast of targeted bittern and rail species, which is played using an amplified speaker during each survey, which will, of course, tremendously boost the detections of these species to a level that will generate the data that we're really after. Next slide, please. So the overall concept of how things work within a square is similar to owls and nightjars. So at the most basic, you use the regular roadside atlas point count stations to locate 1 to 8 randomly chosen Marshburg Survey point count stations. And then you perform at least one 10-minute point count at each station. An optional second point count at each station, at least 10 days later, but in the same year, is highly encouraged, but it's not required. So the second visit allows us to adjust in various ways for differences in detection probabilities. But we don't need this to be done at all stations. It's fine if you can only do one survey visit for whatever reason, and that'll happen in a lot of cases, especially say in squares in Northern Ontario, where you might only be visiting on one day or whatever. But it's gold, so to speak, if you can do the 2 visits. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does one determine where the actual point count stations are within a square? Well, here's probably the most unique and challenging aspect of the whole process. We weren't able to randomly pre-select the stations ahead of time, as is the case for owls and nightjars, which of course are done at the regular roadside point count stations. We weren't able to do this because existing geospatial GIS layers for identifying marshbird habitat is, somewhat surprisingly, not good enough at a fine enough scale across most of the province. Next slide, please. So instead, you will randomly identify Marshburg survey stations within a square in 2 steps, like you see here. First, you'll randomly identify Marshbird habitat patches, which are shown here in blue. And second, you'll identify Marshbird survey stations within or at the edge of Marshbird habitat patches, which are shown here as black dots. Next slide, please. There's a detailed definition of what constitutes a Marshbird habitat patch in the protocol manual, but briefly here, a Marshbird habitat patch is a marsh, an open-grown bog, fen, or shrub wetland, or a mix of these wetland types that's at least 1 hectare in size. A Marshbird habitat patch is not a shallow, unvegetated lake, nor is it a swamp with dense, relatively tall trees that form mostly a closed canopy overhead. And of course, this definition is meant to capture all of the potential types of wetlands throughout the province that we expect the targeted marshbird species like bitterns and rails to occur in. Next slide, please. So how does all this shake out when applied to an actual square? You might have skipped ahead 1 slide there. You might have to go back 1. There we go. Perfect. So you start with designated roadside survey station number 1, which in this case is up at the top center. Then you select the closest accessible marshbird habitat patch that meets the criteria. And you keep going if you can up to designated roadside survey station number 8. Now in this square, it was only possible to place 5 stations, and that's fine. In many squares, there won't be, or we won't be able to get access to 8 stations, and that's okay. Even 1 station in a square is really useful data. Next slide, please. So depending on road access and the arrangement of wetlands in any particular square, the placement of stations can take many different forms, like you see here in some examples that are given in the protocol manual. Whether you follow the instructions exactly to identify marshbird habitat patches and the stations within them are not necessarily all that important. The most important thing is that you randomly pre-select marshbird habitat patches and not just go to your favorite spots. Next slide, please. So you'll have to use a combination of information from the Atlas Square map, online aerial satellite imagery, and field observations to locate and confirm that marshbird habitat patches meet the criteria. Next slide, please. The protocol manual covers various scenarios that will crop up, such as what do you do if there are no marshbird habitat patches? That will happen, especially in some parts of southwestern Ontario where we've lost a lot of wetlands. Or there are no accessible marshbird habitat patches. There may be marshes, but they're all on private land and you can't get to them. So that that's covered in the manual as to what to do in those situations. And what do you do in a square that has no roads and therefore has no designated roadside point count stations? We cover that as well. Next slide, please. So once you've identified a marshbird habitat patch, then you'll find a good accessible vantage point at the edge of or within each patch that is approximately closest to the designated survey station that was used to identify the patch. And this point is a Marshburg Survey station, and this is the location from which you will conduct the surveys. You'll need to record the coordinates of each station using a GPS unit or alternatively your phone so they can be recorded in the database. Next slide, please. It's possible that one large marshbird habitat patch is closest to one or more of the designated roadside points. So in this case, you can place more than one station at the edge of or within that large patch, as long as each station is greater than 400 meters apart. If the patch is all filled up, then proceed to the next nearest patch to the designated roadside point, and so on. Next slide, please. So most Marshbird survey stations will be at the edge of a quiet back road, but if they do fall on busy roads, which will happen with loud traffic, we encourage you to place them, if possible, a reasonable distance away from the road for better listening during surveys. And if a marshbird habitat patch is really big, in other words, it's greater than about 300 meters across at its widest point, then we encourage you to place stations at least 100 meters out into the interior of the patch and access them with a canoe or a boat if possible, but it's certainly not required. This is because, of course, many of the targeted marshbird species occur at much greater abundance towards the middle of really large wetlands. Next slide, please. So please keep the following criteria in mind when placing marshbird survey stations so that other atlasers, perhaps yourself, will more easily be able to visit the stations in the future. So make sure they're physically accessible at the time of year of the survey, obviously legally accessible, no trespassing, near a safe parking spot in a quiet location with little traffic, not directly in front of a house. Points should be at the very edge of or within the marshbird habitat patch, and more than 400 meters from any marshbird survey, any other marshbird survey station. Next slide, please. Okay, so you've randomly identified marshbird habitat patches and you've placed the survey stations at the edge of or within the patches. So what happens during actual surveys at these stations? Well, it's very much like a regular roadside point count or point counts for either owls or nightjars. You stand quietly or sit quietly in your boat and count all birds seen or heard during a 10-minute period. You start the broadcast on your amplified playback equipment at the very start of the 10-minute count, and the broadcast keeps track of the time for you. There's beeps at the beginning and beeps at the very end. Next slide, please. So you'll record on a map 5 pieces of information for each individual or group of individuals of each species that you see or hear during each survey. So those 5 pieces of information are obviously the species using the 4-letter codes that Mike was talking about. Second, you'll record the time interval of the first detection of 3 possible time intervals, the first 3 minutes, the next 2 minutes, and the final 5 minutes. So the 3 time slices are set up that way. You'll also record the distance of first detection of 3 possible distance categories or bands, the same ones that Mike was talking about, 0 to 50 meters, 50 to 100, and greater than 100 meters. The 4th piece of information is the direction of the first detection. Simply, is it in front of you or behind you? And 5, the breeding evidence, if applicable. And again, we're only asking for probable and confirmed. So this approach is nearly identical to the most sophisticated regular roadside point count protocol. Recording these many different pieces of information, of course, will allow us to make more robust population size estimates because we can use those different time slices and the different distance bands either on their own or in combination to do a bunch of really crazy fancy math that really lets us get a good estimate of the actual density, the actual total number of birds at those points. And then we can extrapolate up across the whole province. And of course, it also, recording all these extra pieces of information allow us to combine the data with other data sets, like the breeding bird survey that's only 3 minutes long, like Mike was saying. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so at the time of your first Marshbird survey, you will perform a simple Marshbird habitat assessment. So at each Marshbird survey station, you'll record 4 pieces of Marshbird habitat information. So 1, the wetland type. There's basically 3 to choose from. 2, the presence of certain influential factors, like is it a beaver pond? Is there a beaver dam influencing the survey area? 3, the percent aerial coverage of major vegetation and land cover types. Basically, we're just asking you to look around you within 100 meters from the survey station and estimate things like, is it 50% of that area that's covered with open water? Is 50% of it, for example, covered in emergent vegetation, and so on. And the last piece of information is the percent aerial coverage of emergent non-woody plants. Because marsh birds really are influenced quite a bit by different types of emergent vegetation, especially, we ask you to zero in on the emergent vegetation and tell us, is half of it cattail, is half of it grass sedge, is half of it phragmites, or whatever the percentage might be. This sounds much more complicated than it really is. It's obviously a big learning curve if you haven't done these kind of things before, but once you've done a few of them, it becomes very easy. But if folks are turned off by it and you don't wish to complete the habitat survey, we understand, we get it. Then as we describe in the protocol manual, you can take a picture of the station, even with your phone would be fine, and send it to us, and we can complete the assessment using the picture and online imagery. We can do it for you. This doesn't work quite as well, but it can be done and it still gets us very useful information. Next slide, please. Okay, so there you have it. I'd like to end by stressing that safety should be top priority while doing these surveys, as with any atlasing activity. The Marshburg survey may find you in fairly isolated areas and might involve overwater work if you're doing stuff in boats. So we provide a long description of tips of how to work safely during these surveys in the protocol manual. And of course, we require everyone to read, understand, and follow those, pretty please. So thank you, and I hope you find these surveys fun and rewarding and hopefully not too complicated. There's a big learning curve, but I think once you've done a few of them, it'll be really fun and easy. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. I think we'll jump right into Mark. Are you able to?
Yep.
Okay, so I think if I just keep going.
Good to go. Great. Welcome, everyone. This is so exciting. And if it does seem a little overwhelming right now, don't worry. We're just getting going. You've got 5 years to figure this all out. If you're new to the Atlas, I promise you, you're going to love it. if you've done this before, we're going to get even better information this time. So it really is an exciting opportunity. I'm here to talk about a couple of things. I get to wear two hats today. The first one is about nest finding and doing some work with the nests. So I don't know if you've gone on to the website before, but if you have, if you click on data entry, next Mike, you'll immediately come to the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas page. And then if you go on to submit, you will see three choices. You'll see submit data, enter nest records, or special surveys. Submit data is for the Atlas, obviously. Special surveys are for the Marsh and the Owl surveys and nightjar surveys that Doug just talked about. And then you've got enter nest records. And if you click on enter nest records, you actually come to Project Nest Watch, which is another project that Birds Canada has been doing through Nature Counts. And in a way, it's a really valuable tool for the Atlas. And it's not something that we're going to heavily promote, but it's something that I hope you'll really get involved with. Can you go to the next, please, Mike? All right, before I get started, if you are interested in searching for nests, or if you do accidentally come across the nest, we've got some concerns and some considerations that you should all pay attention to. So don't forget that this is a critical time for breeding birds. So we have to be mindful and protect them as much as possible. That doesn't mean we can't survey and actually survey nests and record information on nests. But when you are searching for them, be extra careful of your movements. A lot of them are ground nesting birds. You can easily step on a nest without realizing it. If you're monitoring nests, much of the monitoring of those nests can be done from a distance once you find it the first time. And if you are uncertain, back away and see if you can figure another way to do it. Ideally, if you could visit that nest 2 or 3 times during early stages of incubation, and then, to see if the young fledged or not, that would provide great data. Next, Mike, please. And while I'm at it, I want to make a little plug for Canadian Lake Saloon Survey, which Doug and Kathy Jones helped coordinate. It's the same sort of idea. We can get additional information on top of what the Atlas provides. We can find out exactly when birds are starting to breed or when they're starting to nest, which can tell us a lot about climate change down the road, and is a nice comparison from the previous Atlas. And we can also learn a lot about productivity. Can you go to the next one, Mike? So for instance, if we can record the fact that we found a nest of a common loon, and 1 month later, we see 2 young on the bird's back, we now know that that was a successful nest. And that's something that the Atlas doesn't provide necessarily. So I really want to promote, if you do accidentally come across a nest or you are searching for them, enter that information into Project Nest Watch, which is available through the Atlas. All right, next, Mike. I also want to give a few tips on how to look for nests if you're interested. The first thing to do, and a lot of us who are birding in migration hotspots like Pelee or Rondo really don't get to see the birds in their natural breeding environment. Keep in mind, a lot of birds are ground nesters or low nesting in bushes. So if you are interested in looking for a specific species or a nest of a specific species, do a little research ahead of time, find out where that species nests. There's no point looking for a hermit thrush 4 feet up in a tree when they're a ground nesting bird. And some of them are very difficult to find. Some of them you're going to have to rely on, looking down at your feet, and all of a sudden a bird pops out 3 feet in front of you. That sort of means, or probably means, that it just flushed off a nest. So that's why you need extra care. There's a lot of resources to help you. You can look at the first 2 atlases. You can look at the Breeding Birds of Ontario by Peck and James. They actually give a lot of detailed information on where nests are, how high they are, and what trees they're even located in. And there's a new Peterson Field Guide to North American bird nests coming out in August of 2021, which will provide even, glossy photos and even additional information. So keep those all in mind. Next, please, Mike. Okay, a couple of tricks to help you with nest finding. If the leaves haven't come out on the trees yet, look for some of the old nests or last year's nests. These will give you a good clue to where to look the following year. So if I've got a red-eyed vireo nest out in front of my house, chances are I'm going to have a red-eyed vireo pair coming back to this same general location, and I should probably search there. Or if I have a Baltimore Oriole nesting at a local park, they're probably going to nest the following year within 100 meters of that last nest site. So it's a great way to sort of say, okay, I'll come back here and check the following year. Next, please, Mike. Also keep in mind all of these safe dates that Mike Burrell's been talking about. And they can come in handy for helping you find nests. Certain species nest at certain times. So right now, woodpeckers and a lot of the cavity nesting species like brown creeper and winter wren will be nesting shortly. Normal songbirds or songbirds that usually build an unenclosed nest in the mixed wood plains and the Carolinian areas will be probably starting in late May. So if you can time some of your trips out into your square or squares you're interested in late May and early June, and then look for evidence, you're more likely to find it. Birds will breed throughout the summer, but there's a really push and a concentration during that sort of last week of May and early June. And all you have to do is look for evidence by looking at the bird's bill mostly, right? If you see a bird with material in its bill, whether it's a fine hair or grass, chances are they're nest building. If you spend a little time, sit quietly and watch, you'll probably find where that bird is going to his nest. Keep in mind, nest building time is fairly sensitive, so try not to disturb the birds at that point. The other thing to keep in mind is 2 or 3 weeks later, usually 12 to sort of 17 days later, eggs hatch and young are in the nest and parents start feeding. So if you see birds with mouths full of food, same thing, sit quietly and just observe and watch. Next, please, Mike. We have to get away from thinking about the gaudy males all the time. The real action, especially for breeding birds, are the females. So whenever you get to see a female, spend the extra time watching and observing her behavior. They're the ones who are going to be going to the nest most of the time. Any information you can get this way will actually help you find and locate the nest. Next, please, Mike. Now, what do you do if you see a nest? It's great to record the information into Project Nest Watch, but say you're kind of curious and you're not sure at what stage they're at. There's actually really easy ways to do it. So with this red start, this is 15 feet up in a tree. I know she's been, she's sitting on the nest. So I am kind of curious, are there eggs? Are there young? Is she just getting started? So there's a really easy way. Next, please, Mike. One of the things I like to carry with me, I know this may sound a little strange, is a bike mirror. Or, it doesn't have to be this big. You don't need to fill up your knapsack with a huge bike mirror. And I often carry a pole with me. The nice thing about this is when I do find a nest, I can just attach the mirror to the pole, or if I have a stick and a little bit of tape with me, I can tie the mirror to the stick and I can just take a quick peek in. I'm not causing a lot of disturbance. I can be in and out in about 30 seconds and I can find out that American redstart had 3 eggs in a nest. And then I don't have to bother it again. I can come back a week later, see if it's feeding. If it's not, I can wait another week and then see how things are going along. All right, next, please, Mike. You can even do this now, and I'm not suggesting everybody does this, but if you suspect there's a bird nesting in a hole and you can't confirm it, because oftentimes birds will not, you could tap on a tree and a bird will not come out, you can actually stick your camera in a hole the size of a flicker, take a quick picture, and confirm whether there's a nest in there or not. It's exactly what I did with this kestrel. The bird wasn't coming out. I just sort of stuck the camera in, realized all of a sudden I've got a female kestrel in the nest hole. Next, please, Mike. All right, I'm going to switch hats now here. Now, for all of us who live in Carolinian Ontario, when I talk about going north to Atlas, I'm not talking about Muskoka. I'm not talking about Manitoulin Island, or I'm not talking about Ottawa. I'm talking about beyond Kenora, beyond Kapuskasing. Next, Mike, please. I'm talking about Ontario actually has ocean, and it's got ocean coastline. There's this magnificent thing called the Hudson Bay Lowlands and the Upper Boreal Forest, which is magical places to see. And if you've ever wanted to go up and visit these areas, the Atlas is this great opportunity. However, I do want to point out, and I do want to stress that it's not going to happen this year due to COVID. The other thing is, if you are thinking about traveling from Southern Ontario into Northern Ontario, check out the website. Check out, oh, sorry, someone clogged me up here. Check out the website for the COVID guidelines under the Get Involved section of tools and resources, and make sure you're doing it safely. The last thing we want to do is have atlasers bringing COVID further north. Next, please, Mike. All right, so if you're going to go northern atlasing, what normally happens is you start with about an 8 or 9 hour drive up to the Sioux or up to Timmins or Cochrane. And then in many cases, you'll get on some kind of plane. It could be a float plane or a beaver or a twin otter. And they'll take you to a location. And we'll talk about the locations in a second. So part of the fun is just getting there, but be aware it takes a couple of days in most cases to even start your northern atlasing trip. Next, please, Mike. A lot of the northern atlas trips are canoe trips. I had the pleasure last Atlas of going with Glenn Cody and Carl Conzi and Jerry Binsfeld, and we had our wonderful guide Nick Mack from Pewanak, who took our canoe with us upstream, and then all we had to do was actually float downstream with the current and visit sites along the way. So it was this wonderful opportunity. We got to be with some of the indigenous communities and learn a little bit more of what life is like in the far north. Next, please, Mike. We also, some of you, if you're really lucky, will get to do some helicopter work. We did some work. I was with Glenn and Don Sutherland, who's obviously very suspicious of me, probably still is. And it was just this wonderful opportunity to get up and see areas that I don't know how else I was going to see otherwise. Next, please, Mike. The north is really incredibly beautiful. Whether you're in the plain or on the ground, it's really exciting to see. Next, Mike, please. However, keep in mind, as beautiful as it is, there are no roads, there are no trails. You're breaking trail yourself. So if you're one of those people who doesn't like to stay on a trail, maybe northern atlasing is for you, because you can go wherever you want. Next, please, Mike. Also keep in mind that accommodations are probably not what you're used to, and the weather can be very unpredictable. This is a snowstorm that we woke up to in early June. So northern atlasing is not for everyone. Next, please, Mike. You will also probably at some point go over your boots, and you'll have to have your dinner underneath some socks that are drying and some very dirty socks that are drying in your tent at some point. Next, please, Mike. You'll also get to spend a lot of time sharing a blood meal with mosquitoes. Unfortunately, it's going to be your blood. The mosquitoes and the black flies can be pretty intense up north. So if you don't like bugs, this may not be where you want to go. And the other thing, next, please, Mike. It's a great opportunity to see mammals that you may not see. So not only do you get the chance to see black bears, you might see caribou or moose. and you might be very close to them. So it's something to get excited about one way or the other. Next, please, Mike. But I can honestly say a shoreline dinner or a shoreline lunch of freshly caught fish, you know, fried in a half a pound of shortening or lard, add it with a bit of salt. It may not be the healthiest, but it is one of the most fantastic meals you'll ever have the pleasure of having. Next, please, Mike. In addition, the birds are incredible. You've got an opportunity, if you're lucky, to see willow ptarmigans sitting on nests or sharp-tailed grouse nesting in those areas. Next. Or you could be walking, trudging through a muskeg thinking, this is crazy, and all of a sudden come upon a sandhill crane chick that's just freshly out of the egg. Next, please, Mike. Or if you're really lucky, you'll get to see pine grosbeaks. This is a photograph of the first nest of Ontario from the last atlas that was ever documented. So there's always surprises around every corner. Next, please, Mike. As you can see on this map, there are a lot of trips that they're going to try and repeat. As I said, we're not going to be able to do it this year, but there are 4 remaining years. And there's an opportunity to go across different parts of the province and in different ways. So there's going to be lake to lodge trips, lowland river trips, MNRF and helicopters, remote community hiking, and road and boat access. So there's different opportunities depending upon your interest. And if you are interested, what you can do, well, we'll get to that in a second. Next, please, Mike. There's also new maps being generated to show exactly where you want and where you're expected to take point counts. As you probably remember, the atlas in the north is divided into 100-kilometer squares. So you've got different 10-kilometer squares that you're responsible for taking point counts in. And that's something to be excited about. So you'll get to travel in a 2.5-week trip from sort of central northern Ontario all the way to the coast. It's just a wonderful opportunity. Next, Mike, please. A couple of things to keep in mind. You've got to plan for a 2 to 3 week trip. That doesn't necessarily include travel time to get to those places or get back home. So 3 weeks is what you want to think about. As I mentioned, it's not available in 2021. If you are interested, contact the Atlas head office. Although I would suggest organize a team that works well together. You need to be healthy, physically capable. I strongly suggest getting someone who likes to fish and someone who likes to cook. I'd also suggest go to the dentist. I've been on 4 northern trips where we've had tooth infections. And so believe it or not, it happens. Everyone who everyone who is going to go up should be both good at general atlasing, point counts, and be willing to do any additional surveys you can, like nest finding or odonate surveys, or download iNaturalist Canada and get onto those as well. Bring a GPS, bring a camera. You might want to get an acquisition license or possession and acquisition license for a firearm in case you do have bear issues. You might also want to get, and I strongly recommend, wilderness first aid training, because help is a long way off, as many as, it could be a day or 2 before you get help. And I can't overestimate the importance of good equipment. You need a good tent. A 4-season tent is advisable. You need comfortable, warm sleeping bags and good boots, because you're going to be walking up to 10 to 20 kilometers a day in these in muskeg. And so that is not an easy thing for boots to handle. You also want to be prepared for all weather, obviously bugs as well. And there will be a manual coming out, so don't fret. You don't have to remember all of this right now. Read the manual. It's really important in this case to do properly. Next, please, Mike. I can't tell you enough. Atlasing in the far north is an exhausting experience, but it's been the highlight of every year of the Atlas that I've been able to travel up there. I think you really will love it. All right, we're going to move on. One more, Mike, please. Just a thanks to everyone involved, including the 5 main partners. and all of the other groups. And a special shout out to Kaylin and Mike, who've done such a great job getting all of this organized, and all the other people behind the scenes who are doing that work as well. Next, Mike, please. All right, don't forget, you can see this on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and I'm going to pass everything over to Natasha at this point. Natasha, are you still around?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Okay, perfect. That was great. That made me really excited, and I am pumped to do some of this year. I hope everyone's feeling that excitement too, especially by seeing those photos, even though I know all of us won't be able to go to the north. We can still try to find some beautiful nature here. So I know we're a little over time, which is totally fine. A lot of great resources. If you want to go take a break, feel free to do that. But we're going to answer some questions, and then at 5 o'clock, and I'll remind everyone again, but there will be a submitting data session starting around 5. So I've kind of tried to group these questions together. Everyone is very excited and very keen, which is great. I'll just say that I have answered a few questions already if people are interested in that, so feel free to check those out. But what happens when a freelancer is doing point counts in a square where the primary atlaser is also doing a point counts? Is there station duplication?
Yeah, there certainly would be if that were the case. We would like to try and avoid that as much as we can. So we ask if you are a freelancer to contact the regional coordinator and check as to whether the principal atlaser will be doing point counts in there.
I'll say that there were questions about the manual, when it'll be available. It'll be soon. It'll be under the instructions tab on the website, so just stay tuned for that. And also questions about the 4-letter codes. That'll also be coming soon under the tools and resources tab, so check that out. Another question of how long after sunrise and for what duration should we do our early morning point counts? I'm assuming that will also be in the manual.
Yeah, but it should have been in my slideshow. I just realized with all this shuffling around. Yeah, it's half an hour before sunrise until 5 hours after sunrise.
Perfect.
And we do recommend, like, when it starts getting towards 9 or 10 o'clock, things are starting to get quieter. So usually it's good to spread them out over those first few hours of the early morning, but especially later towards the end of June and into early July, it's getting pretty quiet in that late morning. You probably want to do fewer points at that time.
And I'm biased, but I'm not a morning person, but point counts are definitely the best. So they are well worth it to get up early. Two questions kind of related. Are point counts done only once in 5 years? If yes, is it better to do it in the last year of the atlas?
So yes, they are only done once, and no, it doesn't really matter what year you do them.
Perfect. Someone on that note too, is it okay to tackle the point counts over several years, some each year? Same question for owl surveys.
Yeah, you can certainly spread them out. I did a lot last atlas of doing we had 25 points we were trying to do. I could do that many on the road in the morning if I started early enough and didn't do anything else. That's sort of the extreme. We don't need to do that. You can mix them into your atlasing as you move around the square, do a few one day, a few another day, spread them out over the years. It's up to you. I do suspect in more developed areas, they're going to get done pretty early, but certainly we're going to need the help up in central Ontario, basically from Muskoka on north. We're going to need a lot of people helping out doing points up there. So would encourage people to be thinking about that.
Just a quick comment, same for Marshbirds. You can do the point counts in different years in a particular square. But if you're going to do the 2 visits at one of the stations, those 2 visits need to be in the same year, but it doesn't matter which year.
Okay, great. And picking up on something you said, Mike, someone asked, does the time spent doing point counts count towards 20 hours coverage in a square?
Yeah, it does.
Perfect. Scrolling back up. I'm not ignoring you. I'm looking at my questions over here. how would someone record birds that they see that aren't singing if they're doing the digital point counts?
They don't, and that's one of the differences between the two, and it's something that we have to work out. We actually are going to things are going to develop a little bit over time with the way we do these. We're going to ask a certain number of people who are doing full point counts by ear to also record them, so that we get an idea of how frequently that happens and the extent to which that happens. And we're going to be rating other data sources to get us basically correction factors as to how which species are likely to be showing up on visual point counts that aren't showing up on the recordings.
I love data.
And maybe I should say, we decided not to do it this year, but we're quite possibly going to introduce the idea of having the person that's doing a digital recording actually identify the birds that they can see. But at this point, we're saying anybody can do the digital point count. But if we're going to introduce this other thing, then we're going to have to make sure that people can identify the birds that they're seeing that are flying around. So we didn't want to jump right into that this first year. We probably will be bringing that in later years.
Perfect. Okay, a few questions are around the kind of digital output. What kind of digital output do you want? What kind of recorder do you need? And also on top of that, do you want photos?
Okay, boy. The digital recordings, we really want you to use the Zoom H2N. If you have something equivalent or very similar to it, and again, on the website, there will be information as to which other devices are equivalent, then yeah, it's okay to use those. And that'll be described. Now I forget what the rest of the question was.
Do you want photos?
Oh, no, we're not doing that just because we don't have an easy way of dealing with it all. I should say that in the north, in the remote north, the kind of places Mark was talking about, we are actually developing a standard protocol for a system for collecting photos around each station. But we're not doing that in the south just because it's a lot to ask the volunteers. We're asking the volunteers a lot already.
If somebody wanted to, the question is, can we send our point count recording to our own reliable source to determine the species lists if they're good at bioacoustic projects in the area that have offered to do this?
Well, that's a good question. We hadn't thought about that one. I don't know. Let's stay tuned on that one. The hope would be that people would go in and use this wild track system. It's a really nice system that they've got for managing the files and for actually going through and identifying visually on the sonogram which song is which as you're going through. And it's a really wonderful way of quantifying. And we're intending to get those up on a website, some examples of those, so people can actually learn from these recordings, more about bird identification. So we certainly encourage everybody to use that wild track system. That's really what's going to be in place. You're still on mute, Natasha.
What do you think I was saying? Take a guess. Should we distinguish between birds that are singing versus like call notes, flyovers, example?
No, it doesn't matter. Really, the point count's all about counting how many birds there are, either in those time bands or if you're interested in doing it in the distance bands as well.
Moving on to time bands, great segue, unplanned. So because of the 3 + 2 minute interval, it would be useful on the app to have a 5-minute timer included, which maybe you can't answer, but just a thought. Yeah,
the hope is to do that. It's sort of high on the priority list, but there's a lot of things that are high on the priority list. So it may not happen by this year, and I kind of doubt it will, given all the other things we're trying to get done. But it almost certainly will be done by next year.
If anyone wants to volunteer, no. Are we recording the like time bands separately? Like, do we do the first 3 minutes and then take time and then do the second 2 minutes? Or is it just a consistent 5 minutes?
No, it's just a solid 5 minutes. There's no gap between the two.
Perfect. Someone said a field nearby is a breeding spot for bobolink. Nice work. Lots of males singing and females flying. How do I point count this?
You just do the best you can. You just count as well as you can, and if you can't count, you have to estimate. You estimate. Yeah. There is always the possibility, if you can say, here's something you can't identify, you can mark that as an unidentified bird, go back later and work out the identity. I'd hesitate to say that with a field full of bobolinks. I mean, you could possibly, as long as you're not going to bias your results, you could, come up with an estimate and then go over later and count them and say, okay, there really were 13. But only as long as your estimate was roughly 13 to start with. If you couldn't see over the brow of the hill, you can only report the ones that you can actually see or hear.
Perfect. I'm going to jump to Marshburg surveys for a second. So what birds are you broadcasting?
Yeah, so the broadcast species, there's 6 of them. So it's least bittern, Sora, Virginia rail, and then there's common gallinule and American coot mixed together, and then pied-billed grebe. Those are the broadcast species for the Marshbird survey.
Perfect. And then a question on northern atlasing. What do you have timing for the northern atlasing trips in mind? Specifically, would they be in May or June, or could this happen in late June, early July? For those of us who are teachers in our other.
Yeah, northern atlasing is probably best in June and early July. June's probably the ideal time, but the farther north you go, the more you can delay. So yeah, if you can do it, or if you're interested, contact the office for more information, and they'll start recording these ideas.
Perfect. All right. I know there's a lot of questions that I didn't get to. We're just going to wrap up. Some of the questions I think will be potentially answered in the next session at 5 about submitting data. And then I think some of them, I'm just reading through, a lot of it will be answered once the manuals come out. So just stay tuned, check out those instructions, and I think those questions will be answered there. But regardless, point counting is great. I wish I could get up to the north, and I'm excited to check out some Marshbirds. So thank you for everyone for coming.
Thanks, Natasha.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Great presentations. Good luck atlasing. It'll be fine. You'll all do great.